Hi, my name is Jeremy Carter. The first time I opened a spreadsheet was to track fantasy football scores, and the first time I tried to do predictive analysis was when I was preparing for a fantasy football draft. So it only makes sense that I continue on with my data analytics journey to use fantasy football as the medium. I've been lucky enough to use these skills in my professional life. I'm deeply passionate about transforming education through data. I design intuitive visualizations that bridge the gap between students and decision makers, ensuring that we see the whole student and not just a statistic or a number. Through the data analytics course from Savvy Coders, I am better equipped to delve into expansive datasets and unlocking insights and solutions. For my Capstone project, it focuses on analyzing and projecting optimal auction budget spending for fantasy football salary cap drafts. Using my own league's data, I'm going to dig deeper into how to construct a team on draft day. This is my fantasy football league. It was founded in 2012. I've been playing fantasy football longer than that, but this is the league that I've been in for over the past decade. In 2013, I won my first championship, and in 2016, I won my second. The problem came in 2019 when we implemented the a superflex position in our league. And since then, in 2021, I got my first last place. Over to the right, you can see our all-time win percentage. A couple of years ago, I was in third position, and now I'm in the fifth position. I would like to move back up those rankings and continue to get better and learn more about how to navigate this new superflex position in fantasy football. A superflex is a roster slot in fantasy football that allows for a quarterback and not just a running back, a wide receiver, or a tight end. This is different than a traditional flex slot, and ideally, the superflex player should always be a second quarterback whenever possible. Over to the right, you can see my actual roster construction from my actual fantasy football league. It's a quarterback, two running backs, three wide receivers, a tight end, flex, an offensive player or a super flex position, and a defensive or special teams position. Throughout the course of this program, I have had some blockers. Originally, the scope of this project extended beyond analyzing my own fantasy football league. I wanted to look at some of the professional leagues, uh, and see what the pros are doing. And then I also wanted to develop a tool where you could put in your own league settings and get feedback on how to, construct your league. I mean, construct your auction budget. This is something that I would hope to continue in the future, and I look forward to continue to look at this data. A large part of this was actually gathering the data, cleaning the data, pulling the data, and now that I have the data, I'm excited to continue to dig and unlock more insights. Another problem that I hope to kind of get farther into, but I spent most of my time focused on overall fantasy points rather than real game outcomes. I think that as I continue to build and dig into this, looking at actual game outcomes would provide more insight. Uh, Currently, and all the data that you're going to see is based on overall fantasy football data and fantasy football points scored. Um, I do think that there's value in going back and looking at the actual breakdowns of teams. That was just a blocker that uh, really time was the thing that prevented me from going that far. So, luckily, luckily and unluckily, my league has kept really comprehensive records as far as our draft data. We have been doing an auction draft for the last 6 years, including this current year in 2023. Before that, we used a snake draft, which is a different style of football. So I really wanted to focus on the auction data, and so I pulled the last 6 years of our fantasy football leagues auction boards, and I also went and got the last 5 years of the top 100, 300 scores in my fantasy football league. So I know that it was relevant and dialed into our actual settings. Um, and so that was the data that I gathered. It ended up being about 1,200 rows of data. So 300 times five or times uh, four. Um, and then I pulled all that together and I used that data to uh, kind of dig into it. And so we'll get into more of how I actually clean that data and combine that data. But it was two separate sources of the previous 4 years. I said 5 years, it's actually 4 years just because one of those years um, we actually weren't doing the auction draft of that year. All right, so what I had to do was pull this data and grab it and pull it into Python. Python, it was my first go using Python, and so there was a lot of learning there. But really, what I needed to do was take that data that was in that complicated spreadsheet, and then pull it and build out a data frame that was useful and that I could actually analyze. And so Python with numpies and pandas was primarily the my tool for doing that. So I got a little bit of my code there. There was a lot more code, but I just wanted to kind of give a snippet of what that code looked like. Um, so this was using the auction data. The good news is once I got, just because the format was the same across the years, once I got 1 year of auction data in, it was pretty easy to get the other years built out into a data frame. So most of the work was just getting that initial data frame built. Once I got the data frame built out, I would save it to a CSV, and I did that, for each year. And additionally, I also pulled in the top scoring from ESPN, like I said, and I pulled those into CSVs as well. Once I had the different CSVs for the each year, what I had to do was then match it. One of the complications that I found is that the player names were not consistent. Sometimes there was a junior at the end or a fourth, and or sometimes the spellings were just slightly off. And so I had to kind of get creative. And after some looking online, I found a module called Fuzzy Wuzzy, and that allowed me to, as long as it was 80% matching, it would allow me to combine the players. And so I was able to combine those two, the auction league data and the scoring leaders data together, using this in Python. Once I had the once I had the data together, I did some initial data exploration. So this is the different wide receiver ranks over time by year, and I thought that that was a really interesting way to look at it. Uh, one of the things that I did was just to label the very top score in each year, just to kind of see those uh, the outlier data and just kind of put a name to those dots. I thought that was useful for me to kind of uh, figure out, exactly who I was thinking about. And so this is just some of my initial data exploration. I did that in Matplotlib. From there, I had to take all this individual spreadsheets. So like I said, I had joined them all in the player name, and that left me with a bunch of different years of spreadsheet. I mean, the different years of CSVs. And so I went to SQL, and I used SQL to combine all those CSVs into one giant CSV that I used because I wanted to look at things over time and look at things through different years. And so SQL allowed me to combine all those into that larger CSV. And so just kind of a quick recap. Up till this point, I hadn't used anything. A lot of what you're going to see from past this point is going to be from uh, built-in Tableau. And so I gathered the data from the league draft history and the top 300 ESPN scoring leaders into CSV files. I pulled that data into Python to first be cleaned, and then I combined it on the player name. I did some initial data exploration using Matplotlib, and then I combined the spreadsheets into one large spreadsheet using SQL, and then I connected that to Tableau, and that leads us to uh, our first looks at our data. So one of the first things I wanted to actually look at was, does the draft matter? And it turns out it does. About 70%, up towards 77% of your points that are scored in a fantasy football league every year are by those drafted players. So it is critical that you do well in the draft, and you walk away from the draft with quality players that are going to contribute to your team. And so that was just kind of my first kind of wrap my brain around it. It does in fact matter. And so if it matters that much, up to 77%, then you should definitely have a strategy going into the draft. So that kind of leads me to the next slide. So I looked at our league history, and you can kind of see that our league, for the most part, there have been kind of slight differences, but for the most part, our league has been really consistent in our drafting. And so what we're looking at is our fantasy points scored. uh, by each position. And so what you can see there is that, quarterbacks, running backs, tight ends, and wide receivers ultimately score similar amount of fantasy points every single year. Uh, there are some fluctuations here or there, but like for the most part, you know, if all of the quarterbacks are going to score within 5,000 points overall. So that was just a chance for me to kind of really start to, break apart this data and wrap my head around it. Um, The next thing I wanted to look at is actually kind of who was scoring those points. And so what we have here is a plot of the highest scoring fantasy football seasons by a player all time in my league. And so if you go up here, you can see that in 2019, Christian McCaffrey scored 470 fantasy points, um, and he is the highest scoring fantasy player in our league of all time. Then you have Lamar Jackson in 2019 as well, and then we have Cooper Cup in 2021. One of the first things I noticed is that while there are a lot of quarterbacks on this league, on this plot, it's not always quarterbacks. There are those chances for those non-quarterback players to have those large outlier seasons, um, and I thought it was nice to visually represent that and kind of and see that on this. The next thing I wanted to look at was fantasy points scored by dollar amount, and so you would think that the more money you spend on a player, the more fantasy points that are going to be scored. I did realize that there were some limitations to this graph just because there are more $2 wide receivers, there are more $3 wide receivers, and so when I'm looking at the sum of fantasy points, it didn't really tell a story, but I wanted to include it just because it was part of the process as I kind of narrowed down my process and how I was going to analyze this data. So the next thing that I realized I needed to do was actually to limit and look at startable players. And so the way that I define startable players is a quarterback one would be in the top 12, because my team is a 12-team league, would be in the top 12 quarterbacks. Um, Quarterback two would be quarterbacks uh, number 13 through 24, and so on. Um, I did think that this was a difficult. I had to go back into Python and do some more cleaning and assign and actually iterate through it and assign a positional ranking to each player by position and by year. So that was an additional blocker that I had to kind of go in and spend some time cleaning once I realized that looking at it as a sum or looking at the total amount of points scored by that position wouldn't work. Um, and so I actually thought this was kind of the first step, really, in kind of understanding and coming up with a strategy, is looking at both the auction budget and the fantasy points by those uh, positional groupings. And so in like I kind of pointed this out earlier, but our league we can start two quarterbacks, up to three running backs, up to four wide receivers, and one tight end. Technically, you can start up to two tight ends, but for the most part, and traditionally, it's either a running back or a wide receiver in your flex spot. And so in the darker blue, you have the auction budget or the amount for those 12. I guess for this one, this is all the years. But say if you narrowed it down to a year, um, right here you have 12 quarterbacks in that first group. They cost $304, and those 12 quarterbacks, the top 12 quarterbacks in the league for the year of 2022, scored 3,832 points. For the second quarterback, for the next 12 quarterbacks, they cost $229, and they scored nearly, 1,500 points less points. And so I thought that this was kind of the really first step into looking at and coming up with a strategy. So if I go back and add the year, we can kind of look at it over time and give us kind of that deeper look at it. So this is 4 years, so that's the top 48 quarterbacks over all the years in that first position. Um, and I this is kind of the part when I started to understand that there, kind of how to allocate. And I thought, well, you want to spend the least amount of money and get the most amount of fantasy points. And so that kind of gave me this next thought. And when I basically I simply divided the total amount of fantasy points uh, by the dollar spent, and I felt like that would give me um, this is kind of my informal points per auction dollar spent is my or PPAD is my calculation that I use, and so for quarterback one, for every dollar you spend on a quarterback one, at least overall, then you get nearly 15 points. For every dollar you spend on a quarterback two, actually, you get almost 18 points. And so if we went down and we looked at it by just, last year, we can kind of really get some insight. So if I wanted to understand how to spend my money, I could use this to kind of give myself a better chance, right? So the wide receiver threes, when you look at those wide receiver threes, you think, wow, I really got more bang for my buck by spending, on those wide receivers number 25 through 36. For every dollar I spent on those wide receivers, I got nearly $25 back in value. So, I mean, 25 fantasy points back in value. And so I thought that this was really insightful, and it really kind of led me to my next step, in which I thought about not only by roster positions, but just on positional positions overall. And so for this next part, I looked at positions overall. So this first part, I think you can see this. We have the top 24 quarterbacks. They're gonna give you, nearly 16 fantasy points per dollar spent. Top 36 running backs in 11, 48 wide receivers, you get nearly 16. And then tight ends, you actually get 25. That was for the top 24, just because I said that you could do the flex. Um, Once again, I want to go look at just 2024, and over time, these seems to change just depending on kind of how those players did each year, right? But for the most part, they kind of live in that range. In 2020, those top 24 quarterbacks are great. And even in 2020, in 2019, like we kind of pointed out in those top 10 with Lamar Jackson, you can see that those were higher. Part of that is also the amount of money that our league was spending on players, and so I think that there have been shifts over time. But for the most part, when we look at it, this kind of gives you a really good insight into how to kind of navigate your auction draft, and it leads me to my conclusions. Um, my conclusions really are, since the adoption of Superflex, I believe that I have budgeted too large of a proportion towards the quarterback position. Um, just because with the belief that quarterbacks score the most points, I want the best quarterbacks. Therefore, I should spend the most money on those quarterbacks. I believe now that that was a wrong approach. I also believe that analyzing fantasy points scored overall, you need to take into account positional limits, or your roster limits. Um, just because there are so many more wide receivers and running backs, I think it really skews the data. So that was kind of the big turning point in this project when I started to limit them or provide those positional groupings. And then the last thing that the biggest takeaway for me is that when looking at it, with this point per auction dollars to analyze the value, I believe that the majority of your budget should be spent on the wide receiver position. Ultimately, the value added or your PPAD is similar to the quarterback position, but fantasy football at the end of the day is really there's a lot of luck involved. And in when you're spending those auction dollars, you want to give yourself as many lottery tickets at getting those elite players, as those those outlier players as possible. When you spend that money at quarterback, you only get two chances, while when you spend that money at wide receiver, you get four opportunities to get those elite players or those outlier players. Moving forward, the majority of my budget will be spent shifting away from spending it at quarterback, spending it at the wide receiver position. I just want to thank everybody, and I want to thank Savvy Coders for giving me this opportunity to spend hours and hours looking at fantasy football data and pretending it was work or school, and so I thought that was that was great. And I learned a lot, and I want to thank everyone at all my instructors and also my classmates. So thanks, and have a good night.